had come up with a vision of a marvelous ship that would outdo any of the other ships of that time. The building of the ship soon began, and in 1912, the most luxurious ship of that time was sailing on its maiden voyage to seek new adventures in the New World. Many of the second-class and third-class passengers were running away from the devastations and their hardships in Europe to seek a new life in either Canada or America. Many of the wealthy were looking to expand their businesses. Many of them, they did not know that this voyage was going to be their last. They were all hopeful and excited. They didn't expect anything bad to happen. As they grew closer and closer to America, their excitement only grew. But on one very cold night, the ship didn't turn in time, and the bottom was sliced open by an iceberg. This iceberg would be the cause of many people's deaths and the destruction of a ship that was considered unsinkable. The RMS Titanic, the most luxurious steamship of its time, was thought to be a gateway to a new and better life. However, the Titanic had many safety flaws. The Titanic was the most luxurious boat of its time, mainly because it made its accommodations for passengers unlike anything they've ever had before. According to an article by TitanicandCompany.com, the boat was worth $7.5 million US, which would be roughly equivalent to $174 million today. The ship weighed 46,000 tons and was 175 feet tall. It had 9 decks. The cost of the first-class ticket was $4,300, while the third-class ticket was $36. Since the ticket prices were so different for the first and third-class passengers, the boat was especially nice for the first class. The public rooms had a salon, a reception room, restaurant, reading room, lounge, and a smoking room. The Titanic was also one of the first ships to have a gym installed. The grand staircase was one of a kind. It extended from the lower landing to the glass above. It was 60 feet tall and carved out of solid oak. The suites had their own private bathroom and were decorated in best styles of that time, such as Georgian and Queen Anne. The second class accommodation weren't as nice as the first class, but the ship still did a great job of giving them entertainment and privacy. Second class was found over 7 decks. They also had part of the grand staircase and had an elevator which ran up and down all the decks. They also had a smoke room and a library. The second class also had their very own restaurant. Their cabins were very similar to those of the first class. The cabins were decorated in white with mahogany furniture. The first class and second class passengers had a lot of the same accommodations. However, the Titanic came a lot less fancy when it came to the third class. Their accommodations were still nice. Most of them had never had or seen those accommodations before. There was a reception room where passengers could go and use as a smoke room. They also held small parties there. Third class was also given a dining room. The third class cabins could compare to the first and second class. They were a little bit less luxurious and a whole lot more modest. Many passengers would share a bathroom. While passengers were enjoying their time, the captain and crew had a different story. While researching the Titanic on History.com, it told me all about the tragedy. It had 4 days into the voyage. Other boats around the Titanic tried to warn the Titanic about the icebergs. The Greek steamer Athenia reported it passed icebergs at noon. The ship Mesabo warned the Titanic about the icebergs at 9:30 p.m. But for some reason, the captain didn't change his route or pay attention to the warnings. At 11:35, 2 hours after being warned from the ship Mesaba, a seaman spotted the iceberg, but it was too late. And the ship scraped against the iceberg. One of the survivors of the night recalled later that it sounded as if someone had drawn a giant fingernail all along the side of the boat. The 10-second collision with the iceberg left a 300-foot gap below the ship's waterline. Shortly after midnight, the ship began to sink. The watertight compartments that the ship's owners had claimed that would keep the ship from going under were severely damaged. At around 12:30, first-class passengers were taken to the lifeboats, where only women and children were allowed to get on. Although the boat seemed to have all the perfect accommodations, it didn't supply enough lifeboats to hold all the passengers. The ship only had enough lifeboats for 1,178 people. The amount of the people have often been debatable, but roughly around 2,200 passengers were on board. Due to the panic, many of the lifeboats would leave with any people on it or half full. As the boat continued to drown, people were saying their last goodbyes to their loved ones. The men would lower the women and their kids down to the lifeboats. Some women would stay with their men because they couldn't bear to leave them behind. Some people knew they were going down and just had to happen. A millionaire on the ship appeared on deck in his full evening attire. The millionaire, gun in hand, said, "We dress in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Captain Smith decided he would go down with the ship. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's boilers exploded, sending the ship into an almost upright position. People then began jumping into the waters to only freeze or drown. Many of the people who didn't jump began sliding down the ship's deck into the icy water below. The people in the lifeboats rowed away to safety, while the rest of the passengers were left to drown or froze to death in the freezing waters of the Atlantic Ocean. When the rescue boat Carpathia finally arrived, it was 4:10 a.m., and the Titanic had already sunk. The Carpathia would pick up around 700 passengers. The other 1,500 passengers found their watery graves at the bottom of the ocean that night. After the tragedy, an inquiry found that the White Star Line neglected to follow certain safety procedures. The insignificant lifeboats were one of the main things that the White Star Line got in trouble for. They didn't have enough boats to hold even half the people on the ship. The Titanic's designers did not want to clutter decks with boats they never intended to use. When the boats were lowered, they weren't filled up all the way. A lot more people could have been saved if they would have made sure they were full. One lifeboat left with only 17 people on it, while lifeboats could fit 70. Another safety flaw was that the crew were poorly trained in deploying them. If they had had training, they would be prepared in situations like this. Another main problem was that the compartments that they said were unsinkable showed the world that this wasn't true. The compartments did not have a roof section over them, so once the compartments filled up, they spilled over to the rest of the boat. One article on ultimatetitanic.com suggests that it was a jar without a lid. So when one compartment filled up, it flowed into the next compartment beside it, and like a chain reaction, all the compartments started to fill up. If the compartments would have had a roof on them, it would slow down the rate of the water got into the other compartments, and the boat would have sank slower, allowing time for help to come. The one thing that Titanic made sure they did right was they supplied enough life vests for everyone. They had an overstock of life vests. The life vests only allowed people to float. Many of the people that had lifeboats on didn't drown, but froze to death in the waters. The wireless radio system on the Titanic was thought to be a brilliant piece of technology. However, when passengers started overwhelming the system to get hold of captains or family members, the crew couldn't get out any messages to the ships nearby. There was a ship called the SS Californian that was only 10 miles away. Because of the high demand of the wireless system, the message didn't get to the ship, or the ship captain didn't have his ship turned on. The biggest safety factor that I think about is why didn't the captain turn into a different route when they were notified hours earlier? As a captain, I would think that you'd want the best interest when you think about your passengers. Many lives were depending on the captain to get them to their destination. However, the captain didn't make a bright decision, and instead he tried to go right through the pass with the icebergs. After seeing all the flaws that the Titanic had, new safety procedures were introduced. According to the book Maritime Disasters, safety protocols came shortly after the tragedy. The creation of the International Ice Patrol came about to monitor icebergs that got in the way of the ship's path. Also, they began using separate frequency calls for distress and personal messages. 24-hour radio watch protocol was established shortly after. Any ship that had 50 or more passengers had to follow the protocol. They made different routes, shifting them farther to the south. Another that was all searchlights must be carried by steamships. If the crew had attended lifeboat drills before the ship was able to set sail, and most importantly, passenger ships had to provide lifeboats for all the passengers on board. RMS Titanic might have been the most luxurious ship of its time, but it turned out to be more of a curse than a dream. Ismay's vision was soon destroyed after its very first voyage. The Titanic that was thought to be unsinkable showed the world that it wasn't true. One of the most famous phrases that comes from the Titanic is that not even God could sink the ship. This phrase comes into my head every time that I hear anything about the Titanic. If only they knew of what lay before them on that April night. The Titanic gave everything its passengers wanted, the perfect amount of entertainment and privacy in their sleeping quarters. But once the Titanic hit the iceberg, everything changed for the worse. All the money that was spent on the Titanic, the grand staircase, the top-of-the-line dishes, everything was destroyed that night. The Titanic goes down in history as one of the most devastating maritime disasters of its time. People running away from all their troubles only ran into their deaths on that dark and frigid night. If only the Titanic would have thought of its safety flaws and planned out different routes to go in case of emergencies before the ship set sail. Many or all lives would have been saved that April night, but since they didn't take the time to do so, the Titanic now rests with all the 1,500 people that died that night below the sea.